Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Kiernan Tague? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Kiernan Tague was born sometime around 2006 and lived in Grosse Pointe Farms, Michigan. This upscale neighborhood on Lake St. Clair is about 13 miles northeast of Detroit. His mother Elizabeth and his father Brian divorced in 2019. Brian later died. Kiernan lived in a house with his mother, who was a campus minister at a local Catholic high school. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On November 17, 2023, while his mother Elizabeth was in Canada, 17-year-old Kiernan used her 2021 BMW X3 M Series SUV to pick up an 18-year-old friend of his named Flynn McCrell. Flynn was at his parents' house. The teenagers had planned on visiting a friend. After this, they were going to return to Flynn's house to play video games. Kiernan arrived at Flynn's house just before 9 p.m. They drove to the friend's house and had a conversation with the friend in the driveway. A few minutes later, Kiernan and Flynn left, presumably on their way back to Flynn's house. Kiernan was driving on Ridge Road in Grosse Pointe Farms, where the speed limit is 25 miles per hour. He accelerated to 105 miles per hour, 80 miles per hour over the speed limit. Near the intersection of Ridge Road and Moran Road, Kiernan lost control of the BMW, hit a utility pole, and then flew into a tree. The force of the collision disintegrated the vehicle. The front suspension, the passenger compartment, the engine, and the transmission all ended up in different places. Both Flynn and Kiernan were wearing their seatbelts. Flynn was killed in the collision. Kiernan survived and exited the SUV before collapsing on the ground. He was transported to a hospital, treated, and ultimately recovered. Here is what the police found during the course of their investigation. Kiernan had a long history of speeding, reckless driving, and having arguments with his mother. Elizabeth monitored her son's driving using a GPS app called Life 360 and knew about at least some of his bad behavior. In July and August of 2023, Kiernan reached ridiculously high speeds in a motor vehicle on 5 separate days. The speeds were 127, 143, 102, 150, and 155 miles per hour. Kiernan took photographs of his speedometer with his cell phone, and he recorded himself drag racing once in September and once in October. On September 14, 2023, Elizabeth texted Kiernan the message, quote, "Slow the blank down right now," unquote. On this day, he had been driving 123 miles per hour. Toward the end of the same month, Kiernan's sister sent him a text message about a local girl who was killed in a collision involving a drunk driver. As if to warn Kiernan, his sister wrote, "Speed limits exist for a reason." 2 hours later, on that same day, Elizabeth sent a text message to Kiernan indicating that she had screenshots of him driving 90 miles per hour in the middle of the night when she did not even know he had left a friend's lake house. Elizabeth mentioned her prior concern about his speeding by writing, quote, "And again, 2 weeks ago, going 123 miles per hour just because," unquote. Pointing out an apparent interest that Kiernan had with fast vehicles, his mother wrote, quote, "And your obsession, word choice intentional, with cars having upwards of 600 horsepower, it's not healthy, it's not safe, and it scares me to my bone," unquote. In October 2023, just 3 weeks after these text messages, Elizabeth purchased the BMW SUV that Kiernan would later destroy. It appears as though this vehicle was for Elizabeth, but Kiernan had access to it. In the first part of the month of November, prior to the collision which occurred on November 17, Kiernan made 94 trips as the driver of a motor vehicle. Half of these trips involved going over 90 miles per hour. For example, on November 1, he drove 153 miles per hour for 20 miles. So he covered those 20 miles in less than 8 minutes. In addition to all this bad driving behavior, Kiernan had a long history of conflict with his mother. Since 2018, law enforcement documented 22 contacts with Kiernan. Most of these involved the police responding to complaints that he was out of control. For example, in 2020, Elizabeth contacted the police and indicated that she had picked up her son at a friend's house when Kiernan became angry. While in the front seat of the vehicle, he turned around and began punching her as she sat in the back seat. He also bit her on the hand. Kiernan was arrested for domestic violence. On August 30, 2023, the police responded to Kiernan's house after another disturbance. Elizabeth had refused to give Kiernan an American Express gold card that he demanded. He allegedly responded to this disappointment by yelling at his mother and throwing items in the house. There was no update on whether Kiernan ever received the gold card. During another incident, which occurred later, Elizabeth refused to let her son use her vehicle. Therefore, he broke a table. On November 3, 2023, just 2 weeks before the fatal collision, Kiernan texted his mother, quote, "I simply asked you to take your car, yet you refused. Now I'm running late, and we have a broken table," unquote. Elizabeth responded by accusing Kiernan of gaslighting her. He responded, "I'm sorry about your table." In addition to these behavioral problems, the police documented other difficulties with Kiernan. For example, he may have taken his mother's credit card without permission, and Elizabeth stated to officers that she was afraid of her son. In March 2024, Kiernan Tague was charged with second-degree murder and released on bail. He was assigned a status in Michigan called Adult Designated. This means that if he is convicted, he could be sentenced as an adult, as a juvenile, or a combination of both. In the state of Michigan, the maximum penalty for second-degree murder is life in prison. Family members of the victim, Flynn McCrell, have asked prosecutors to file charges against Kiernan's mother, Elizabeth, citing the precedent set by the notorious case of Ethan Crumley's parents, Jennifer and James. At the time I'm making this video, the only charges filed in this case are against Kiernan. Now moving to my analysis. Presumably, if Elizabeth was charged with a crime based on the actions of her son, it would be for something like involuntary manslaughter, like she was aware of Kiernan's bad driving but disregarded the risk. The argument for charging her is based on the outcome of a 2021 murder case in Michigan involving a teenager named Ethan Crumley. This case ultimately resulted in his parents being convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Before weighing the evidence in the case of Elizabeth, let's take a look at the precedent set by the Crumley case. In November 2021, 15-year-old Ethan Crumley used a 9mm pistol to murder 4 students at his high school. He pleaded guilty less than a year later, but the state of Michigan was also interested in prosecuting his parents, Jennifer and James. They were each charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter. The state argued that Ethan's parents knew that he had mental health difficulties, including disturbing thoughts, yet gave him access to the pistol used in the murders. In separate trials held in 2024, Jennifer and James were found guilty on all charges. They received the maximum sentence of 15 years in prison with parole eligibility in 10 years. This prosecution has been highly controversial. Some people believe it was appropriate and a long time coming. Others see it as an overreach by the government. Regardless of whether filing charges was a good idea or not, the successful prosecution has now set a precedent. Parents can be held accountable for crimes committed by their children. In theory, the Crumley case developed a roadmap that could be used to charge Kiernan's mother, Elizabeth. Any potential case against her would involve the state of Michigan having 2 theories available to prove involuntary manslaughter. The first theory is gross negligence. The state could argue that Elizabeth knew about a danger to others. Using ordinary care would have prevented injury, and she failed to use ordinary care when a reasonable person would have known the result was likely to be serious injury. The second theory is based on a failure to perform a legal duty. Elizabeth willfully neglected or refused to control her son Kiernan, and the death of the victim was directly caused by this failure. The idea that Kiernan would cause someone's death was reasonably foreseeable. All the members of the jury would have to agree that at least one of these theories was satisfied, but they do not have to agree on the same theory. The structure of the law is both vague and confusing, but this is what the jury would have to contend with in Michigan. With this precedent set by the Crumley case in mind, is Elizabeth guilty of involuntary manslaughter? Should the state charge her just like they charged Jennifer and James? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that Elizabeth is guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. There is no question that Elizabeth knew that Kiernan repeatedly drove recklessly. She even warned her son about this behavior, saying it scared her to the bone. Any reasonable person would have known that Kiernan's driving could result in death. The information that Elizabeth gathered about Kiernan's dangerous behavior spanned several months. She knew for a long time that he was dangerous behind the wheel. It wasn't like she only found out a few days before the incident. The BMW involved in the fatal collision was owned by Elizabeth. She knew it was a particularly powerful vehicle, yet she allowed Kiernan to have access to the vehicle when she was away. Moving to the exculpatory factors, Kiernan possessed a valid driver's license. He should not have, but he did. Elizabeth repeatedly warned Kiernan not to drive recklessly. This, of course, indicates that she knew about his behavior. However, it also represents an attempt to stop him from causing harm. One could argue that Elizabeth did not disregard the risk. Rather, she actively attempted to mitigate the risk. The history of conflict between Elizabeth and Kiernan is not consistent with Elizabeth having a tremendous amount of power over her son. He was out of control, and she was afraid of him. Maybe this fear prevented Elizabeth from taking action. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I think that Elizabeth is guilty of involuntary manslaughter? In my opinion, yes. I believe she is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt based on the way the law is written in Michigan. I don't know if she will ever be charged, but if that happens, she will probably be in some trouble. The main problem for Elizabeth is the fact that she knew about the dangerous behavior for a long time. Jennifer and James Crumley were convicted, and they only knew about the danger for a short time. Elizabeth was well aware that Kiernan regularly drove over 100 miles per hour on public roads. What did she expect to happen? Of course he was going to kill someone eventually. The homicide was reasonably foreseeable. It is worth noting that there's another case outside of Michigan that is similar to this case. In May 2023, a teenager in New York who was driving a BMW at 101 miles per hour in a 30-mile-per-hour zone crashed into a truck. A passenger in the BMW was killed. The driver's parents were charged with manslaughter because their teenage son was not supposed to be driving alone. They eventually pleaded guilty to endangering the welfare of a child and were sentenced to a 26-week parenting class. This case is a little different because the teenager was driving illegally and Kiernan was allowed to drive. Even so, it indicates that the parent liability winds of change are blowing against Elizabeth. Moving to my last question, what do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Kiernan was self-centered, impulsive, irresponsible, reckless, demanding, fearless, excitement-seeking, manipulative, and had a sense of entitlement. He and his mother had a toxic relationship which may have involved mixed messages. For example, about 6 weeks before the fatal collision, Elizabeth asked Kiernan if he would pick up a bottle of wine. It's not clear how he would do this considering he was 17. However, one possible explanation was revealed a week later. Elizabeth sent Kiernan a screenshot of a website which described the criminal penalties for possessing a fake identification. Kiernan would act out when he was denied something that he wanted, for example, an American Express Gold card, or to use his mother's vehicle. The incident where Kiernan broke the table and sent the message, "Now I'm running late and we have a broken table," indicates how he manipulated his mother. He wanted to establish a causal link between the refusal to get his way and destruction, as if he was not the mediating variable. It's like he was saying, "Look what you made me do." If Elizabeth ends up being convicted, this will only reinforce Kiernan's way of thinking. Now moving to my final thoughts. Flynn's death was completely preventable. Kiernan never should have been driving a vehicle. Elizabeth did a lot of talking. She warned Kiernan many times, but she didn't take the action necessary to stop him from killing another person. Perhaps she was so desperate to keep the peace, she was willing to risk death and destruction. She claimed that her son's behavior scared her to the bone. But to which bone is she referring? Certainly, it's not a backbone. Those are my thoughts in the case of Kiernan Tague. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They consistently generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.